Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to all of you. Welcome to the Baker Institute. It's a real pleasure for me tonight to introduce our speaker. His bio is at length in your program there, and it's a lengthy bio because he's accomplished a lot. But he's going to talk to you tonight and then take Q's and A's on the topic of the elusive search for a resolution of the Arab-Israeli conflict. That's a topic that is, of course, close to my heart, and I know from direct personal involvement the extraordinary experience and insight that he brings to this critical subject. Aaron was a key member, I should say, of our peace process team when I was Secretary of State. I quickly learned to respect his knowledge and to value his judgment because he possessed a keen sense of the nuance of Middle East politics, and he understood both the importance as well as the limits of American influence on the various parties. Among his many accomplishments, he was instrumental in helping us broker the Madrid Peace Conference, which was the first ever face-to-face meeting between Israel and all of its Arab neighbors. Working on the Arab-Israeli peace process can be, to put it mildly, a frustrating experience. It is a marathon and not a sprint. And on one memorable occasion, I'm afraid I vented my impatience at a speaker when I told him, Aaron, I just want you to know, if I had another life, I'd like to be a Middle East specialist just like you, because then I would have guaranteed and permanent employment. Well, here we are 15 years later, and I'm glad we have Middle East specialists like Aaron Miller, specialist of the caliber of our speaker tonight, and that's because Arab-Israeli peace remains a very critical objective of American foreign policy, and it will surely be at the very top of the next president's foreign policy agenda. Will it be easy to forge a comprehensive and permanent Arab-Israeli peace? Of course not. If it were easy, it would have been done almost 40 years ago, but is it necessary? Well, my answer to that question is yes. It's necessary if only because the alternatives, continued violence, mistrust, and insecurity, so clearly damage the well-being of Israelis and Arabs alike, and also, let me stress, threaten the stability of the entire region. Our speaker has spent 25 years of his life with both Democratic and Republican administrations in search of a just and lasting peace between Israel and its Arab neighbors. The author of 4 books and the author of numerous articles on the Middle East, he is one of our nation's foremost experts on that troubled and vital region. To put it bluntly, ladies and gentlemen, what our speaker doesn't know about the Arab-Israeli peace process isn't worth knowing. So allow me to present to you a distinguished scholar and a very fine public servant, one who served this country remarkably well through the years, Aaron Miller.
Mr. Baker, thank you very much. Ambassador to Virginia, it's a pleasure for me to be here in Houston again. It's also very special for me. I worked for 6 secretaries of state, beginning with George Shultz and ending with Colin Powell. And I resigned from the State Department in January of 2003, not because I had lost faith in the power of American diplomacy, because I had concluded rightly that the course and the run toward Arab-Israeli peace was going to be a very long and bumpy road. Of those 6 secretaries, the most effective, beyond a doubt, the toughest, the most pragmatic, and ultimately the most successful was Secretary Baker. And although it took him 6 months to stop calling me Andy, once he did, I was ushered into a very close and elite circle. And it was an extraordinary experience. When people ask me what was the most memorable and stirring moment for me of the 20-plus years I spent doing this, it was October of 1990. It was late in the day on a Friday, and we were standing in the ballroom of the King David Hotel listening to Secretary Baker and then Foreign Minister, Russian Foreign Minister, Soviet Foreign Minister Boris Penkin call for issuance of invitations to what would become the Madrid Peace Conference. And I knew from then on, whatever the future would bring, the Middle East, the Arab-Israeli peace process would never be the same again. And that was largely as a consequence of Secretary Baker's efforts and the support that he received from the first President Bush. I'm on a book tour, in a sense, and it's a book that I never intended to write, The Much Too Promised Land, America's Elusive Search for Arab-Israeli Peace. When I decided to write it, I really wanted to write a book that was clear and honest, because I had persuaded myself that the stakes this country faced in this very volatile and turbulent region were increasingly costly, even prohibitive if we couldn't find a way to manage our relations. The primary threat to this country is not going to come from an ascendant and competitive China. It's not going to come from an economically powerful and united Europe. It's not even going to come from a former Soviet Union seeking to regain its previous glory as an empire. It's going to come from a dysfunctional, divided, and angry and conflict-ridden Middle East. And it is not a threat that can be measured in generations and administrations. It must be measured during the course of time. And America needs an effective policy to deal with these challenges. If the guiding principle of a foreign policy is to protect your homeland, and the truth is that is what a foreign policy is all about. If you can't protect your homeland, you really don't need a foreign policy. 9/11 was the second bloodiest day in American history, only surpassed and exceeded by the Battle of Antietam in September of 1862. And we're going to face a challenge from this region, which we have to find a way to manage. So I set out to write a book that was clear and honest, and a book that looked at why, these many years, have we not been succeeding in this particularly turbulent and important part of the world. Most of the problems out there are not our responsibilities. I have a deep respect for American power. I also have a deep respect and humility for what any great power can achieve in this particular region. It's littered, literally, with the remains of great powers who believed wrongly that they could somehow impose their will on smaller ones. Iraq may be the most cautionary of tales in this regard. But as I looked out at the last 16 years of American policy, we stumbled for 8 years under Bill Clinton about how to make peace, and we stumbled for 8 years under George W. Bush about how to make war and to protect our interests. And after 16 years, we are neither liked, feared, nor respected in a part of the world that is increasingly critical to our national security interests. I tried to ask myself why. What was it about America that seemed to make the situation that we inherited and confronted worse? And I came to two conclusions, and I talk about them in the book. The first was that we don't pay any attention to history. There's a wonderful British historian, A.J.P. Taylor, who says the only lesson of history is that there are no lessons. Well, that's a very interesting thing to think about. But don't think about it for too long. Because if you ignore the past, then history will be a cruel and unforgiving teacher. I'd ask you only to consider one question. How many Americans were killed during the entire American occupation of Japan? We occupied Japan for 7 years, from 1945 to 1952. And the answer to that question is none. Not 5, not 10, not 3. None. Not one American was killed during an entire 7-year occupation by the United States military of Japan. A defeated nation, and whatever imperfections MacArthur had, he was smart enough to understand the importance of working with existing institutions, even the emperor. Did we consider these historical lessons as we contemplated our invasion and occupation of Iraq? That was the first problem. I'm a trained historian. I never thought in time. And that, I think, is a message to us. Second, we persist in seeing the world not the way it really is, but the way we want it to be. And I think that may not be a uniquely American attribute, but it flows, it seems to me, from one fundamental fact. And I try to explain this to people who don't live here, and even to people who do. If you want to know and understand why America behaves the way it does abroad, consider only this. We are the only great power in the history of the world who has managed to achieve a level of physical security and detachment unprecedented in history. We have non-predatory neighbors to our north and to our south, and we have fish to our east and west. What one historian called our liquid assets. Think about it. Because our security explains many things. It explains our profound optimism. I lived for 20 years with a split-the-difference view of the world. Imagine, it's day 8 of the Camp David Summit in July of 2000. Discussion is now focused on the issue of Jerusalem, and specifically the issue of overlapping sacred space. 2 mosques, holy to Islam, sitting on top of a platform which covers the remains of both the first and the second temples, holy to the Jews. A more complicated problem probably doesn't exist in the Arab-Israeli conflict. And yet here we were, wonderfully endearing Americans, trying to persuade Israelis and Palestinians to give up sovereignty. The first thing we tried was to persuade them to give sovereignty to God. These were holy sites, after all. So we're going to take sovereignty away from the Palestinians and away from the Israelis, and we're going to reposit it with the Lord. Well, they rejected that idea, not surprisingly. Then we went to up and down sovereignty. We'll give sovereignty to the Palestinians on top, and we'll give sovereignty to the Israelis for what lies beneath. All of these ingenious, rational fixes rejected out of hand, because Jerusalem is not to be shared. History teaches us Jerusalem is to be possessed. You possess Jerusalem in the name of God, in the name of the tribe, in the name of the national group. It need not be so. But Americans better understand and respect the attachment of these smaller powers or tribes to these issues. Where we are also explains our naivete and our capacity to confuse the fact that Arabs and Israelis are just like we are. They're not. I write in the book about a story 10 years ago, taking my daughter to see Sean Connery in The Rock at a Washington area theater. And in Washington, when you see a lot of well-built guys talking into their lapels, it usually means that there's a lot of security around. So I'm looking to see who is in the theater. So there, 7 or 8 rows in front of my daughter Jen and myself, 2 people looked very familiar. Sure enough, it's King Hussein and Queen Noor. So my eye meets his. We exchange a few words. There he is, dressed in a blue blazer and a button-down shirt and jeans. And I wander back to my daughter and I said, isn't this extraordinary? You, me, Washington, Sean Connery, The Rock, the King of Jordan. It's as if we were all part of some family. Now, we may have stuff in common, but King Hussein's experiences aren't ours. He watched his grandfather murdered at the age of 12 in Jerusalem. He presided over a fragile enterprise called the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. And he presided well, but he had to make decisions relating to his political identity and his physical existence. And while the Israelis relate to us better, they're really not like us either. I remember having a Passover Seder with Yitzhak Rabin in 1974, before he became prime minister. And with Rabin, the worst thing to do was to talk without thinking about what you were saying. And Sadat had waged the war, and I was going on and on about how this represented a great opportunity. And with a wave of a hand that I would come to know and respect in the years to follow, he said, "You don't live here. You know nothing about the Arabs." I didn't have much to say for the rest of the evening. But where we are is really important to how we behave. So I decided to write this book, and I borrowed a line, again in the book, from Michael Jackson, who doesn't impart much philosophy. But on this one, he had it right. And he said, if you want to make a change, if it's your personal life, if it's your business life, and even in diplomacy. You want to make a change? Then the place to start is by looking in the mirror. That's the place to start. Whoever is responsible for whatever, and we can go on and blame Ehud Barak and Yasser Arafat all day long for the failure of the Camp David summit, and they deserve to be blamed. But we also have to assume responsibility. We really do. And I would hearken back, not only because he's here, but because I believe it. The last serious foreign policy we had toward this region, and it was only a 4-year run, so it wasn't sufficiently tested. But the balance of pragmatism, toughness, trying to find the balance between doing too much on one hand, which was Bill Clinton's problem, and not doing enough on the other, which was George W. Bush's problem on the Arab-Israeli issue. The last serious approach we had was the President's father and Secretary of State Baker. And we need to think about this, not to congratulate ourselves. We have to think hard about what was it that enabled those years to produce this kind of effective diplomacy. So I wrote this book. The reviews have been pretty good. I know there are not a lot of people who are happy about it. I decided I would go out and interview just about everybody I could find. With the exception of Bill Clinton, who wouldn't see me, I saw all of our former presidents, including Jerry Ford before he died. We have 9 living secretaries of state. I saw all of them, key national security advisors. I went out and interviewed evangelical Christians, American Jews, American Arabs, including Jerry Falwell before he died, and sitting senators and congressmen, to write a book that I thought looked at the issue of why America succeeded when we did and why didn't we succeed under certain circumstances. And I drew 5 or 6 lessons, and I will lay them out. And I'm not here to sell you anything. Each of these things needs to be considered by you in its own right, because on the Arab-Israeli issue, truth is never served up on some kind of silver platter. It's hard to try to understand fairly and equitably what drives this conflict. But that understanding is absolutely critical to an honest analysis of the problem and any conceivable prescription. If you turn this conflict into a morality play, which pits the forces of goodness on one hand against the forces of darkness on the other, and there's plenty of ammunition, trust me, to go around to keep the Arabs and Israel's partisans here at home fighting for a long, long time. And that's not good. It's not good for American interests. And above all, that's what needs to be considered. So my conclusions are these. Number one, no matter how badly we want this, the reality is, to borrow a biblical metaphor, you can't make bricks without straw. The existential stakes for the Arabs and the Israelis on these issues, 2 of the most extraordinary Arab and Israeli leaders, Yitzhak Rabin and Anwar Sadat, paid for their peace process policy with their lives. It's not just a question of being turned out of office. It's a question of living or dying, not to mention the future of their nations that they carry on their shoulders. So the decisions that need to be taken, the raw material, needs to be there. It really does. And it's no coincidence that in all of the major breakthroughs, Egypt-Israel, Jordan-Israel, Palestinians and Israel, Americans were informed after the fact that Arabs and Israelis had done some extraordinary secret diplomacy. You cannot make bricks without straw, because the small powers will always have a greater stake in the outcome of their struggles than a distant power like the United States, however powerful it thinks it may be. Number 2, you need a brickmaker. It's fine to say that the raw material must exist in the region, but you need, as Kissinger described it to me, the hand that pulls it all together. And that's the real issue for American presidents and secretaries. How do you become an effective brickmaker? We are an indispensable brickmaker. Not because we're just big and strong, but because we've managed to have, at times when we pursue our policies wisely, the trust and confidence of both the Arabs and the Israelis. Now, there are a lot of bad baseball metaphors in my book. I'm a baseball fan. I just happen to have the Washington Nationals and the Baltimore Orioles as my teams. But I created a Peace Process Hall of Fame in my book. 3 Americans get in. Only 3. It has nothing to do with sentiment. It has to do with failure or success. Nothing to do with whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. In my Hall of Fame, 2 Republican secretaries of state get in and 1 Democratic president. Because Henry Kissinger, Jimmy Carter, and James Baker succeeded in an enterprise so fraught and riddled with the prospects for failure and false starts and humiliation for would-be American peacemakers, that to do serious business on this issue is remarkable. It really is remarkable. Kissinger, for his 3 disengagement agreements in the wake of the 1973 war, one of which, by the way, signed on June 1st, 1974 between Israel and Syria, has made the Israeli-Syrian border the quietest and most manageable of all of the borders in this region. Jimmy Carter, of course, for his brokering of an Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty, and James Baker for putting together Madrid. Now, it was my view that these 3, I call them the bad boys of U.S. diplomacy, which is an arguable proposition, but it's drawn from 2 very bad movies in the 1990s, which I happen to enjoy, Bad Boys 1 and 2, about 2 tough-talking, really tough, but irreverent Miami narcotics cops who got the job done. When I asked Kissinger what he thought about being in the club with these other 2, Kissinger said, well, why is Jimmy Carter there? And when I asked Jimmy Carter what he thought about being with these 3, he said, wait a minute, Kissinger was much too devious to be in this club. But I must say, and I'm not pulling punches here, the 2 of them had nothing but the most profoundest respect for Secretary Baker. But these 3 pulled together what I call the 4 T's of effective American diplomacy. Number 1, toughness. Nobody's going to plant a tree in your honor if you succeed, because you have to push Arabs and Israelis further than they themselves believe they were willing to go. Number 2, you do have to gain the trust of the Arabs and Israelis, and not in a kind of sentimental respect, but you have to respect their red lines, and they need to know that you will not undermine them. You may push them, but you won't push them into deal breakers beyond where their domestic politics can take them. 3rd is timing. You really have to know, the 3rd T, how much you can actually achieve. Otherwise, you'll over-engage, like Bill Clinton did, or you'll under-engage, like George W. Bush has done. And finally, tenacity, which is a very important characteristic. This is not about a day or a week. It's about investing time. A friend of mine who used to be president of Harvard University, he's not president of Harvard anymore because he said a lot of controversial things, said one thing that I'll never forget, and it is the wisest piece of philosophy. And Larry Summers said that in the history of the world, nobody ever washed a rental car. And what he meant was, it's so profound, because you only care about what you own. You only care about what you own. And if presidents and secretaries don't invest in this, the Arabs and the Israelis and their domestic opponents will play you, like a finely tuned violin. These 4 T's have not been seen, in my judgment, since 1991. And if America is going to hope to play an effective role again in Arab-Israeli peacemaking, and it's a long shot right now, these 4 T's have to somehow find a way to come together. Let me make 3 additional points and then conclude. Our relationship with the Israelis. I have a chapter in this book called Israel's Lawyers, How Domestic Politics Affects our policy toward the Arab-Israeli conflict. And this term, Israel's Lawyers, was actually borrowed from Kissinger. Dan Kurtzer and I used to use it in front of Secretary Baker, who, not surprisingly, liked this word. But the point was right. And I wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post in May of '05, which cost me my interview with President Clinton. He was the only one of our former presidents who would not see me. Whether he was angry or someone around him was angry, I don't know. But the piece argued quite simply, if you want to do effective diplomacy, then your client, and I'm not a lawyer, your client is the agreement. You become an advocate for both sides. And if you fail to understand that, and you become an advocate for one side over the other, you will fail. I don't care if it's divorce law, trade negotiations, diplomacy. You will fail. And when we play our role correctly, when we allow our special relationship with the Israelis, which is extremely important, it's one of the keys of our influence. But when we allow that special relationship to become exclusive, when we don't demand reciprocity, when we fail to take into account and hold the Israelis to account for policies that don't serve their interests and undermine ours, when we agree too frequently, as we did at Camp David, with bold but ultimately reckless Israeli or Arab ideas, we're going to fail. And many of my friends in the Jewish community don't understand this. They somehow think that we're sacrificing our relationship with the Israelis or Israel's security interests. It's nonsense. Israel celebrates its 60th birthday tomorrow. The resilience of this relationship is a permanent fixture, in my judgment, in American foreign policy. And that's fine as long as we understand the difference between special and exclusive. Because when the line gets blurred, as it has in my judgment for the last 16 years, we can't hope to even get in the game. And in part, that was the problem with Bill Clinton's policies. No one was more empathetic. No one cared more. No one tried to do more than Bill Clinton. But that chapter is called Mr. Nice Guy. Bill Clinton and the Arabs and Israelis, he loved too much. Because empathy alone is not enough. You have to be disciplined, you have to be focused, and you have to be willing to say no. Sometimes you have to be willing to say no. Camp David was a gamble, and it was a very costly gamble for America. Because as I approach my 60th year, I am ultimately persuaded that in life, the most compelling ideology is not democracy, it's not nationalism, it's not even capitalism. The most compelling ideology in life is success, because success generates power and success generates constituents. And we have not been succeeding, and failure generates the opposite. George W. Bush, on the other hand, inherited a very bad hand on Arab-Israeli peacemaking. And governing really is only about choosing. That's what it means to govern. You decide what's important to you and what's not important. And we disengaged. We disengaged for far too long. And we got wrapped around a notion that somehow we could pursue transformative diplomacy, big ideas. Iraq, fairy dusting the Middle East with democracy. This region hates big ideas. The last three big ideas to come out of this region were Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And they ended up, in the case of Judaism and Christianity, in having much more of an influence on us than we did on them. Now, late in the day, the administration has wisely understood that it must come back to this. And it must, above all, ensure that it passes to its Republican or Democratic successor, whoever that may be, something that works. Because if not, the next president will walk away from this issue very, very fast. And America cannot afford to walk away from it because of all of our interests out there. The Arab-Israeli issue is not the key to protecting our interests, but it is an issue that bangs around out in the Arab and Muslim world with an intensity and a ferocity that creates tremendous rage and emotion, negative toward America. Casey Stengel once said that the key to good management was keeping the 9 guys who hate your guts away from the 9 guys who haven't made up their minds. Now, he was one smart guy. There are a lot of people in that region who haven't yet made up their minds about America. Yes, some may hate us, as the president says, because we love freedom. But I don't think that's true. for the vast majority of Arabs and Muslims. I think they don't like us because we don't listen and we pursue policies that aren't in our interests or, frankly, in theirs. So we can't afford to be on the wrong side of this issue. Let me close on one note of hope. The first and last president that ever had any influence on me, which is a sad commentary in its own right, was Jack Kennedy. I was 13 when he was assassinated. Kennedy described himself in a way that I think is right for America, whether it's whatever area of the world we're pursuing our interests in. Kennedy described himself as an idealist without illusion. I think that's where we need to be. Never, ever give up on the prospects and the possibility that this world can be made to be a better place. Because I have a 28 and a 25-year-old. I don't have the right to give up. Even if I was cynical and despairing, I can't give up. But as you go through this process of trying to change things in your world, do so with your eyes open. Because the implications, costs, and consequences for America are now higher than ever before. Thank you very much.
Aaron is open to taking questions. Why don't you just,
Sure.
Whoever raises their hand, and I'm sure. Don't tell me you've answered all the questions about the Middle East and the Arab world. I can't believe that. There
Yes,
we go.
all right.
There we go.
What is on the table right now that George W. could leave on the table specifically for what's even within grasp that he could put on the table to leave for the next administration?
Well, here's what's not on the table. A Palestinian state up and running by the end of '08. A peace treaty between Israelis and Palestinians. None of those things are on the table. What is on the table and what is possible, I still think, even at this late date, because it's being driven largely not by us, but by the Arabs and the Israelis, are two things. Number one, a piece of paper agreed to on the part of Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, weak and constrained, but democratically elected, and Ehud Olmert, very currently, with tremendous political problems at home. But it is conceivable by year's end that the two of them, and they've been having scores of hours of private conversations on the four core issues of the conflict: Jerusalem, borders, refugees, and security. They could leave a document. And when I was out in L.A. Selling books a couple weeks ago, I used this great line from Samuel Goldwyn, who said, "An oral agreement isn't worth the paper it's written on." Well, the people in L.A. really appreciate that. But in diplomacy, and even in Texas, I said the other night that I know a man's word is, and a woman's word is their bond, but nonetheless, an agreement on a piece of paper is really important. They could leave one of those. Framework agreement. Not detailed, necessarily, but they could go further than any Israeli and Palestinian leader have ever gone. That's number one. Number two, the Egyptians have been at work now for weeks trying to broker an informal agreement between Israel and Hamas. And that is also a necessary piece of this puzzle. Because the situation on the ground, the absence of economic life in Gaza, rockets out of Gaza, Israeli checkpoints, prisoner exchange, these things are important to restore some measure of credibility. But don't make no mistake, the next mediator, whoever it is going to confront one problem which is really quite severe, and that is the Palestinian Humpty Dumpty fell off the wall, and it's now cracked into at least two parts. And if there's going to be an agreement that can be implemented, Palestinian unity is absolutely essential. Because no Palestinian prime minister could ever commit the Palestinian people, divided as it is, to an agreement on these issues which affect their political identity and their very existence. And no Israeli prime minister is ever going to make existential concessions to a Palestinian president who doesn't control all the guns. And I don't care if you're the mayor of Houston or Chevy Chase or Sweden or Egypt. Unless you maintain a monopoly over the forces of violence within your society, no one's going to respect you. Your citizens aren't going to respect you, and your neighbors aren't going to respect you. That's the problem that currently stands in the greatest problem that stands in the way on the part of the Palestinian side. But with enough focus and effort and some luck, the administration could actually leave to its successors a better hand than it inherited. And that, in the land of miracles, would be pretty much a miracle.
But Aaron, let me ask you a question. Wouldn't that require that the Egyptian effort be successful? I mean, you're not going to get an agreement that you can leave to the next administration that doesn't have the entire Palestinian polity subscribing to it, can you?
No. Well, you can't get an agreement.
If Fatah if Abbas agrees to something, and Hamas is not on board, Hamas is going to have to say no to that agreement.
Right.
And they will.
Which means that either one of two things is going to happen. They're going to continue to negotiate until there's a measure of reconciliation between the two sides. Or they're going to reach an agreement, put it on the shelf, and try to bring Hamas around. But I don't see any way that you can make peace with half of the Palestinians and be at war with the other half. It contains too many contradictions. Yes.
Thanks very much for your talk. I'm actually a historian here as well at Rice, and what I would like from you now is a bit more analysis, because you gave a very nice narrative as to the pitfalls of U.S. diplomacy, the few moments of success. But other than the character of the individuals you mentioned, Kissinger, President Carter, and Secretary Baker, what is it about America today, other than the sort of grand theories, but what is it about America today that does not allow the United States to engage or take seriously, as you said, the Arab perspectives? And in other words, why do we have Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, and John McCain on the only issue where there's no back and forth Israel? We support Israel, period. And there's no discussion on this in the public sphere. So I guess, how does that factor into your analysis? Because I like the analysis, but...
Right. Well, you've identified one... there are two sets of constraints which impede American diplomacy. One is my second chapter I call Gulliver's Troubles. How a great power manages in a world of small ones. That's a profoundly important point. We don't do well at that. Even when we succeed at doing effective diplomacy, it requires an enormous amount of effort. Usually, in the case of Carter, 13 days in September of 1978 to hammer out a framework agreement. Within weeks, it was all opened up again. And it would take Carter another trip in March of 1979, a big risk, to secure a peace treaty. So that's the first set of constraints. The second set are the internal constraints. Those are the problems of what I call Israel's lawyers. And there's a reality. You can accept it or not accept it, but it's a reality. And you talk to John Sununu, as I did. Stop whining about the pro-Israeli community, he said to me. This is not junior, this is senior. Stop whining about the community and read the Constitution. Read it. Or study American politics and understand that the system in which we function is one that is perfectly set up and designed to be lobbied, to be pressured. That lobby is not the point. I argue in the book that Israel has 5 lawyers. I mean, I got myself into trouble by claiming that Israel had 1. Israel has 5 lawyers. A passionate and well-organized Jewish community of 5.3 million that has made Israel a survival issue. A very sophisticated congressional lobby that guards, in my judgment, a pre-existing tilt. Most senators and congressmen on Capitol Hill, they're not passionately involved in Israel. There are a significant number who are. And as Sununu explained to me, you're the representative from Des Moines. What do you care about? You care about making sure the family farm goes to the descendants. You're worried about farm subsidies. So some guy from AIPAC brings you a petition, and you think to yourself, why am I going to create a headache for myself? I don't care about this issue. I'm going to sign it. That's the second lobby. The third are millions of evangelical Christians. Go down to San Antonio and sit through John Hagee's Night to Honor Israel. 8,000 evangelical Christians. 3 hours in the most extraordinary tribute to the state of Israel. Not one mention of Jesus Christ in 3 hours. Because what John Hagee has discovered is that it's all about value affinity. Americans relate to those abroad who, rightly or wrongly, appear to be like them. And in the wake of 9/11, the gap has opened up on the value affinity issue in a profound way. Fourth, the Arabs themselves, who I argue in the book are one of Israel's most effective advocates. The two Mr. A's that I write about, Hafez Assad and Mr. Yasser Arafat, never terribly attractive figures to the American public and political elites, have now been replaced by a third Mr. A, and he's not even an Arab. He's the president of Iran. And every day he validates the pro-Israeli community's dream. He validates it by threatening nuclear extinction of Israel. And finally, the most effective lawyer, I call this person the Jewish lobby of one. The impact that Israeli prime ministers have on American presidents. I saw it up close with Rabin on Bill Clinton. I saw it with Ariel Sharon on George W. Bush. These five lawyers paint a case in this system which is hugely compelling. So that lobby's lobby isn't the point. The question is, do presidents lead? That's the point. When we have succeeded in Arab-Israeli peacemaking, it's because secretaries of state have either convinced their presidents or the presidents understand it intuitively that we need to follow our own interests. And guess what happens when presidents lead? Nixon, Kissinger, Jimmy Carter, George H.W. Bush, James Baker. You can actually get something done because the pro-Israeli community in America has a powerful voice. It does not have a veto. So if you ask me why we engage so episodically, why there are so many failures, it's because climbing these two mountains, the mountain of Gulliver's troubles on one hand and the mountain of Israel's lawyers on the other, those are big mountains. And America's busy. America's got a lot of other things going on. And that's from being in this system and watching it for 25 years. That's the best explanation, the most honest explanation that I can offer you. Yes?
One question, last question.
Oh, for me.
It's yours.
Oh, thanks. Thought you were going to take it.
No. I'm a good host.
I wanted to ask you about the veto since you brought it up. Since you are a Middle East historian and you did say Americans don't pay much attention to history, thought I'd bring a little bit up and ask you your thought on it. Could you comment on America's apparent policy of vetoing UN security resolutions critical of Israel? There have been more than 40. And Israel's constant rejection of UN General Assembly resolutions with regard to Palestinians, including a peaceful resolution to the question of Palestine. And do you think that these points usually left out of talks like this could have anything to do about the lack of peace?
I know this is going to come as a shock to you, and it may burst 1,000 bubbles. And this is, by the way, is not a Republican or a Democratic issue. Since you had negotiations between Arabs and Israelis, since the 90s, we have essentially come up with a new set of reference points. And international law or UN resolutions, by and large, are not one of them. In a negotiation, and this is my second point, and again, right or wrong, this is the way it is. In a negotiation, when American presidents and secretaries want to succeed, they are prepared to be tough, as the three bad boys were tough, using a lot of pressure. You read some of the letters that Nixon and Kissinger sent to the Israelis in the 70s. They're extraordinary. They really are amazing. But in a negotiation where you want to succeed, you can bring pressure to bear, but only if it results in your succeeding. The notion that you're going to go after the Israelis with a 2x4 on moral principle because somehow you've got a UN General Assembly or even a Security Council resolution, not going to do it. you're not going to do it. Because if you're a president and a secretary, you'll do it if it relates to your strategy of how to win. The notion of freewheeling pressure without purpose, I've never met a president, possibly with the exception of Jimmy Carter. And Jimmy Carter was unique. He was the only American leader who ran after the Arab-Israeli peace process. The others realized what a 50-year headache it was and weren't interested in getting involved in it. They got involved when they had to manage it or when they believed they had made a commitment to one side or the other. So freewheeling pressure, let's go support a UN Security Council resolution because it's the right thing to do, because we have to be balanced. I understand the compelling logic, and perhaps I can also understand your frustration with American administrations who don't respect international law. International law is not the frame of reference. I'm just reporting here. Don't shoot me. International law is not the frame of reference that American presidents and secretaries use when they confront problems between Arabs and Israelis that need to be resolved. And it's a matter, you can say it's a matter of domestic politics, that's partly the case, but more so it's a matter of what works and what doesn't. I remember in March when Secretary Baker had his first meeting with the Palestinians, there were 19 Palestinians at that meeting, then the numbers shrank to 5 and then to 3, because meeting with Americans, even Secretary Baker, was politically very sensitive. But the complaints about settlement activity were profound, absolutely profound. And the notion that the UN was essentially going to rescue the Palestinians from the policies of the Israeli occupation was never a talking point that we incorporated into our pitch. Rightly or wrongly, we said to them, quite honestly, you want an end to settlement activity? Then you're going to have to create a political process. I'm here to help you. You help me, I can help you. So I get this question all the time, and my answer is wholly unsatisfactory for people who believe in international law, for people who believe in morality and ethics. All right? But I'm not here to sustain your illusions. I wrote this book with all of its problems and imperfections to lay out for you how this process actually works. Or doesn't.
Thank you very much, Aaron. That was superb presentation. Now, I'm sure you're all very interested in his book. Aaron will be signing whoever wishes to purchase one of his books outside. So we'll adjourn to the Commons. Thank you.